Hi everyone. My name is Noah Lubinsky, and I am joining you today from South Africa, Johannesburg in particular, where me and a few of my friends started a very strange, very fun thing called Queer Fight Club, and I'm using that as kind of a way to start thinking about heterotopic freedom dreaming, thinking about a way in which we create spaces and what it means to create those spaces. So why then am I spending a bunch of time telling you about this weird thing that me and my friends started? Um, I started this autoethnographic study with the questions of who belongs in the city and how do we create those spaces of belonging? Why do we need community? Specifically, why do we need queer and neurodivergent community? And why is that so often so extraordinarily difficult? Um, so, with that in mind, um, same issue as before. With that in mind, I'm then going to be speaking about a few things. First of all, the disappearance of the third space and reclaiming the right to the city. Second of all, leading on from that, how we can think about transgeography and this idea of no space. From this idea of no space, then moving from the ideas of utopias to heterotopias, specifically through this mechanism of freedom dreaming, and then discussing studying play in the global south, and then finally we actually get into the fun stuff of Queer Fight Club or QFC Joburg. So I think we have some of us have this idea of what third space looks like or third places, and I know that there has been some discourse also around how we shouldn't necessarily be thinking about third spaces, but rather thinking about reclaiming the city and reclaiming our rights to the city. So I'll be thinking about both of these things in tandem. Third spaces here refer to community gathering spots outside of home and work, such as cafes and parks. But I also think we can quite specifically, when thinking about queerness, think about the nightclub here, and very specific queer nightclubs and how those work. Here I'm thinking with Marcia Koa, who speaks about, and my pronunciation here is infinitely off, Los Sucros Negros, or black holes of society, which find ways to tunnel through, reach, escape velocity, appear and disappear unpredictably. I think many of us have also heard this idea that young people are having less sex, right? There's all these new surveys about how Gen Zs are having less sex, and there's a lot of reasons for this, possibly. I think much of this, though, is to do with this destruction of the right to the city, destruction of access to parks, to different places where people can hook up. So then what do we do with this when our right to the city is being continually destroyed or moved away from? Um, I start here with a quote from a quite well-known South African queer um, activist who says, "We create spaces with our own existence." This is Bev Ditsi. Um, and so I think this is an important way to think about this, not in a kind of um, lazy, although lazy is also a strange term, but lazy way of saying that, simply by being there, we change things. But rather to say that there is something deeply, like integrally different about a space when it is trans and when there are trans people doing things. So here in particular, I'm thinking with Eva Hayward, Zavier Liverman, and Cameron Orchard Rich as my main foundations. Um, and to think that bodies are not products of environments, but we are co-conspirators in the creation of that environment. Um, and this is what I really want to think about, is how we think through that environment, how we create that environment, and what intentional things and unintentional things come into that environmental creation. In this, I'm thinking specifically with Hayward's web, um, who Eva Hayward, in the piece Spider City Sex, uses this idea of a spider's web as part of its body, to think about how our bodies extend into our environments and how queerness changes our environment as we change with it, right? Because a spider can feel anything that's happening on its web. A spider can feel, when something here is happening, because that environment, that space around it, that home that it has created, is also part of itself. Um, Borrowing from Lefebvre, here, Hayward says that spiders produce and secrete and occupy a space, which engenders according to its own lights, the space of its web, of its strangeness, and of its needs. So I'm thinking here in terms of individual bodies, but more than that, I'm thinking about the ways in which our communities extend and the ways in which we extend our own bodies and movement through those communities. I think this is also kind of fun, to think about in the ways that we often speak about webs in queer vernacular, right? If you have a particularly incestuous friend group or polycule, um, or anything like that, which is another part of Queer Fight Club that I will not be getting into today. So we have this one theorization of trans space, trans embodiment, as very specifically changing and secreting into the world around us. We can then think about that in conjunction or as alternatively to how Jack Geiserking argues that trans geography is a geography of no place, because there has long been the idea that trans people do not exist. Right. So, on the one hand, we have people like Hayward theorizing that we create these environments, we create the trans geography through our bodies moving through the city. And then on the other hand, we have Jack King saying that we have a geography of no place. Um, and I find this idea of no place very gripping if we think about how we think through futures and specifically ideas of utopia. Utopia, meaning quite literally a no place, right? Utopia, a no place. And so I want us to think about how in queerness, how in community building, we sometimes fall into that trap of a no place, of a dreaming of a utopia, um, rather than sort of heterotopic freedom dreamings, right? Rather than trying to create a space within the world we exist and secreting into that space. Um, so that's where I start thinking about play and about Fight Club in particular. Um, I'm here drawing from Zavier Liverman, who has also done quite a bit of work on Soweto in Johannesburg, um, and specifically looks at play in Soweto, and kind of why we need to look at play. Here he's looking at play in terms of partying as well, but yeah, play is an activity that demands serious attention because it provides possibilities for the discovery of new social configuration, right? When we play in a space, we make it a usable space, we make it our own. And here I'm using his term usable space as an idea that space takes on meanings that are intimately connected to notions of race, class, and gender and sexuality, and therefore usable space speaks to communities that are multiply marginalized, but to find agentive methods of reworking space in both urban and non-metropolitan area to reconfigure space for the means of survival. This reconfiguration is the creative labor of appropriation and reappropriation that is central to the process of Black queer self-making in township space, speaking specifically to his work. I here have a lot of thoughts about freedom dreaming. I'll skip it for now based on time, and get into what then actually is QFC. So here is the very long thing we sent out on our groups to anyone who is going to join. As you can see, it's a slightly long list of a few autistic people trying to be as explicit as possible for the many forms of neurodivergent people coming into the space and trying to understand what it means to come to a queer fight club. So yeah, Queer Fight Club takes place on Tuesday evenings, most often in the suburbs of, in a specific suburb of Johannesburg. While the start time is stated as 6:30 p.m., we're lucky if we get to the stretching at the beginning by 7:15. We have a WhatsApp group with over 60 members, I think now 70 or 80, but every week around 15 to 20 people come. And as it evolves, as it grows, there are some people that are regulars and some that move through it in interesting ways. Um, this, of course, feels like an exponential growth from where we started in 2022 with four of us. Kind of trying to figure out what it means. We begin each section with names and pronouns, excited to see when people experiment with new identifiers. For myself and many others, QFC has also been a space to explore our lost boyhoods, to explore masculinities that through our first adolescence were gay kept and deemed dangerous. It is an attempt at a queer heterotopia that it is at once deeply and intimately about gender, and yet because of that about gentleness, it is also a space that is in many ways genderless entirely, or where the gender isn't. Everyone has very much gender, and therefore the gender kind of isn't in the space. The rules are ever expanding and shifting, some stated and some more cultural mores. For example, you really don't ask people what they do for a living. Um, we are there to be our most frivolous selves, and so how we spend our days is at best irrelevant and at worst counterproductive to think about. The experience of QFC, therefore, is not fixed but deeply mediated by when you may come, which members are there at the night, and what cultural memory they hold. We also recently did our first Solidarity Mutual Aid event due to a few funding things. So, yeah, the grappling takes space placed close to the ground. This is an example of what we call a sock fight. So where the point is to the last person with at least one sock left wins. And there's many more fun videos that I will not have time for. So I believe studying QFC is probably a thing I'm hopefully going to be doing for many years because hopefully the space will keep on changing and expanding in interesting and stressful and fun ways. But for now, I think I'm studying QFC to understand queer heterotopias and the possibilities and limitations of freedom dreaming presented within them, the assemblages of queer and trans boyhoods within the space, and responsibilities of justice within community formation. So this is also my slide to be like, these are the things I really want to talk about. If any of them interest you and you want to give me a chance to blab on about them later in the questions, please do. Um, but for now, I'm going to end off with um, a quote from Robin Kelly in their book on freedom dreamings, Black Radical Imagination, which is to say that trying to envision somewhere in advance of nowhere is an extremely difficult task, yet it is a matter of great urgency. With our new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Um, Thank you.
Good morning. Well, good morning where I am, everyone. My name is Xavier Lord Williams, and yes, my topic is Black transgender liberation, past, present, and future. I just want to acknowledge that we're not going to even begin to touch on all the resilience that encompasses in this community in this short amount of time. So I am coming live from Tongva, which is also known as Los Angeles, here on Turtle Island in the United States. So I just want to acknowledge that we're occupying indigenous lands and we celebrate and uplift everyone in the African diaspora. We hold space for the liberation of our people across the globe. We represent the red, black, and green for the blood, the color of our skin, and the land. And just for, I know for us here in the States, which is unfortunately impacting globally, but particularly for our community, it's been a challenge, and that's an understatement. So I'm just, going to challenge everyone to think about an affirmation that they may want to hold on to. So a little bit about me, my pronouns are he, him, his. I'm also good with they, them. Just really quickly, I grew up in New York City. I am a speech pathologist. I work with preschool students, so we do a lot of cooking. So that's me making pancakes for my students. I'm currently a doctoral student at California State University of Fullerton, hopefully finishing in a year. And I love Star Wars, so this is my little Jedi training. And here, this is me breaking the law by using the restroom in North Carolina. So again, we have a short amount of time, so I'm hoping to just really highlight some of the key moments in Black trans history, highlight some activists and movements, and really kind of focus on, acknowledging the current landscape, but really envision a future that's liberated and what it might take for us to get there. So again, I want to really, stress that we are a resilient community, right? And given that, we are being legislated, right? Our existence is being legislated here. We are still managing to thrive and survive, and just our mere existence is really an act of rebellion. So Black trans mutual aid networks, right? I mean, if we think about, any sort of revolutionary period in history, right? We think about people of color as always being on the front line, right? And we're going to acknowledge that. So our chosen families create vital lifelines of care, resilience, and solidarity in the face of systemic marginalization. And just the fact that we're all here and we're all supporting one another is really speaks to that. Through our online activism and increased visibility, Black trans communities are reclaiming narratives, building power, and demanding justice on their own terms. And I would say that that holds true for many of our communities within the trans umbrella. Sure, we got to this slide. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I went out of order somehow. Yeah, okay. My apologies. All right, so I wanted to ground us in this quote, and we'll talk about Martha P. Johnson also much later, but no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. And I think that if we look at like the larger LGBTQ plus community, I think that definitely is something we want to definitely focus that, our community inside of that larger community is under attack. So when we look at the intersection of being Black and trans, right? Black and trans individuals face significant systemic challenges, particularly concerning violence and employment discrimination, although that goes across many places. In the past year, right? So in 2024, at least 36 transgender and gender expansive people were murdered in the United States, with Black trans women encompassing half of those victims. Additionally, Black trans adults will experience gender identity discrimination while applying for jobs at work. In the past 3 years, faced an unemployment rate of 23%, significantly higher than the national average of 6%. So again, we can't separate that intersection of race and gender. So looking at our trans history, right, despite what the rhetoric that's being passed, we've been here, we've always been here. And again, I'm giving just a quick snapshot. So I just want to sort of highlight some folks. Again, because of the historical record keeping, right, we're not always clear about pronouns. So I will divert to they when I'm not sure. So we have here on on my left, William Cathay, who was one of the who again went by also Cathay Williams, was one of the first African-American women to enlist in the U.S. Army, right? So disguising their gender, and they served in the Buffalo Soldiers. So this predates, Civil War. We also have Little Axe Broadnecks, who was a pioneering gospel singer, and they traveled in a gospel group with siblings. And they were really brown gaping in terms of performing in male gospel quartets while being assigned female at birth. And then we have Lucy Hicks Anderson, who was born here in California, where I live, was a Black transgender woman who lived openly. And when her gender was discovered through a medical exam, she continued to, live authentically and stand up for trans rights. So key Black moments in trans history, and also in Black trans history, we have what predated Stonewall, right? A lot of people think of sort of trans liberation starting with Stonewall in 1969. But prior to that, here in California, we had the Compton, California riots. And at the Compton Cafe was, just a spot that folks would gather at. It wasn't a specifically trans place, but a lot of drag queens would gather there, and they were constantly harassed. And on this one particular night, a drag queen decided that they had had enough, and they threw coffee in the place of a police officer, which kicked off a rebellion that lasted several days, and they protested outside of this cafe. And then, of course, we have 3 years later, we have the Stonewall Uprising Rebellion of 1969. Again, we were looking at, police raids and danger and violence towards the trans community, but particularly against Black trans women. And there were several folks who stood up, but I will highlight Marsha P. Johnson, another trans Black icon, and Zavier Rivera, a trans woman of color. And again, I'm just highlighting just some of the folks. So this is not inclusive, but I definitely want to just at least kind of give a shout out to some of our folks that really held it down for us. So we talked a little bit about Martha P. Johnson in terms of the Stonewall Rebellion, but Martha P. Johnson continued to not just, was present at Stonewall, obviously, but she started really doing a lot of work around transvestite sex workers and started an organization to advocate for them. She died, unfortunately, mysteriously, in 1992. And the next one, I know Miss Major spoke at this conference last year, and just she's such a powerhouse. I got to meet her last year in Boston. And, she obviously was on the front lines back in, during the time of the 60s, but is still out there. She's still, continues to travel and advocate and really inspire young folks to really get out there. And she's even said, she's like, I thought I was done. I thought my work was done, but I got to do what I got to do. So we definitely want to, big up her. And the next woman who we recently lost one of our trans sisters in 2020, Monica Roberts. And she was a trans journalist and really an activist and in terms of being visible and representing us in the media. And last meaning last on this slide, but not in our history, is Stormy. And I got to meet Stormy back when I was just a young club head back in New York City. And Stormy was, reported to have thrown one of the first punches at Stonewall. Stormy was a biracial lesbian and drag king who, just was always for me like such a visible force in our community back in New York. So we definitely want to acknowledge what's happening right now, right? There's just an absolute overt attempt at legislation and erasure in mainstream media, in history, in codifying, our existence, right? So violence and homicide rates of trans women continue to grow. And I think that as we continue to have leaders who are openly hostile and violent towards our community, we're going to see, unfortunately, a increase in that, right? And so we have medical and legal gatekeeping. We have so many anti-trans bills. Just in 2023 alone in the United States, over 500 bills that targeted the LGBT community were introduced. And the majority of them were really aimed at like limiting access to healthcare for trans youth and for trans adults. And I think, again, when we consider the intersection of race and gender, even more marginalized are going to be Black trans folks and Black trans youth. Okay, so I kind of went out of order a little bit. I knew I wasn't. So I just, again, when we talk about where we're at now, right? I mean, I think that, there are so many folks who are in the community, who are visible, who are making their mark. So again, I'm not, recognizing that I'm not going to get to highlight everyone, but I did want to highlight Cayenne, who has started an organization called GLITS, Gay and Lesbians Living in a Transgender Society, and it's a Black-led trans org. And it's really dedicated to providing that holistic care. And I think that these orgs are going to be so crucial. I feel like, we're going to have to pretty much, in terms of trans care, look at, what underground trans care might potentially look like and how we as a community can kind of manage that. And then another organization I wanted to big up was the House of Tulip, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana, here in the States. And it was one of the organizations, two of the founders were Black women, and this organization has really been centered around housing and healthcare in New Orleans, a primarily Black community. So we've talked about earlier, representation is so important, right? So I'm just again highlighting just a few folks, right, in the arts and culture and sports. And particularly I'll start with Kai alums who was one of the first openly trans, was the first openly trans Division I sports player when they were in college, when he was in college. And given the again the legislation and the rhetoric around trans athletes, I definitely want to highlight them. And then, most of us are familiar with the work of Laverne Cox. And I think that trans liberation happens in so many ways. And so to see someone now who's currently on a new show, right? So there's Orange is the New Black, Clean Slate, which is on, I believe it's on Amazon Prime or Netflix. But she's in a sitcom. This is their first season. Yes, Ford is a Black documentary filmmaker, one of the first openly trans persons to be nominated for an Oscar. And then Janet Mock, who is an activist and an author and a journalist and a filmmaker. And then I have to give a little props to the show Pose, which really centers the experiences of trans actors playing trans roles. And it's a predominantly cast of color, very heavily Black cast. All right, I'm rushing because I have about 3 minutes. So think Noah talked a little bit about freedom dreaming, right? And some of the work of Bettina Love. And as I think about where we're at, and again, I'm in the United States. I know not everybody is, but unfortunately that will impact the trans community globally, right? So really thinking about what could the future of Black trans liberation look like, and how can we come together and how can our allies, right? Because I don't think it's always should be on us to do all of the work. Really investing in those Black trans-led organizations. I'm in a Black trans fraternity, non-collegiate fraternity, decriminalizing survival, right? Ending policing and incarceration of trans folks. And when those incidences of incarceration do need to occur, making sure that they are allowed access to healthcare and allowed access to be placed in the proper gender facilities. I know there's probably a lot of Canadians on here, so definitely universal access to healthcare, period, full stop, right? But to affirming healthcare and housing and education that centers trans history and identity. I know, again, this is the tip of the iceberg, but our history goes so deep, and so and we continue to have history makers daily. And so really radical imagination and dreaming into existence, a world of joy, safety, and celebration for Black trans lives, and again, trans folks throughout the diaspora, right? And then I think I made it right under 15 minutes. So thank you. Hopefully I'll get to hear more from you during the Q&A.
All right. So good morning, everyone. I guess it's still morning for some of you. I'm in the afternoon. And thank y'all so much for being here with us. I'm sorry that we couldn't be there in person with many of you, but we're so excited to have the chance to share some thoughts with you about new approaches to Black trans history. We're going to start our presentation with me, Nikita, giving a short introduction to set the scene, and then I'm going to hand it off to my co-presenter, Ryan. So I am finishing a PhD at Columbia University. My own research focuses on intersecting histories of gender, race, sexuality, and social movements in the modern US. But last fall, I had the opportunity to teach a course on trans history, and I wanted to make sure I expanded outside of my own focus on the 20th century US. And since the course was a small seminar with a focus on primary sources and a final research project, I wanted to offer my students some solid grounding in trans history research methods. And fortunately, I was lucky enough to know exactly the right person, who is my co-panelist, Kinsey. I invited him to come in and speak to my students about his research into 19th century Black trans history in New York City, where we both live. And what he presented absolutely blew my mind and my students' minds, as I hope it will blow your minds today too, in the short amount of time that we have. So my role in this panel is just to briefly set up Raya's incredible research by offering a bit of historiographical framing about the story of one particular figure from the early mid-1800s named Mary Jones, how her life has been narrated by previous scholars, and how Raya's work points in new directions that can expand how we understand the Black trans past. So many of you who are familiar with trans history may have heard of Mary Jones, also known as Peter Sawali, Eliza Smith, Beefsteak Pete, and a variety of other names. She, and I'm going to use the pronoun she in the name Jones, although we can't know for sure what she would have preferred. She lived in New York City between the 1830s and the 1850s. She may have lived in New Orleans previously. She worked in the sex trade, and she was incarcerated several times. New York City newspapers reported on her arrests and trials on several occasions, and a lithograph print featuring an illustration of her circulated in the city around that time. So until recently, historians had only uncovered a few sources about her life, and I want to tell you a little bit about how that story unfolded. So the first historian to write about Mary Jones was Timothy Guilfoyle in a book from 1992 called City of Eros. It's a history of prostitution in 19th century New York. Guilfoyle briefly notes Jones using male pronouns as an example of the intersection of homosexual worlds and the culture of prostitution and brothels. He references a court record in 2 newspapers from 1836, and he reprints the lithograph that shows her. A few years later, in 2001, Jonathan Ned Katz, a well-known gay historian, in his book Love Stories, Sex Between Men Before Homosexuality, examines the same 1836 sources in more depth, while also mentioning newspaper references to her from a decade later. Katz describes Jones as a cross-dressed man, analyzes her life through the lenses of the history of male-male sexuality, working class life, and interracial tensions and intimacies, and he concludes that the sources, quote, leave many questions unanswered. A few years later, the performance studies scholar Tavia Nyong'o, in his 2009 book, The Amalgamation Waltz, analyzed Jones's 1836 trial in the context of anti-abolitionist riots and white anxieties over amalgamation or interracial reproduction. And he criticizes Mary Jones's exclusion from African-American histories of New York. Nyong'o's account also uses male pronouns, which he explains, quote, I have opted to preserve the male gender identity ascribed by the courts and press in order to highlight their sense of transgression. And he draws on the same sources that Guilfoyle, Katz had used before him. So more recently, C. Riley Snorton's 2017 study, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, examines Jones not as a recoverable trans figure from the past, but as an indication of how, quote, the ungendering of Blackness became a site of fugitive maneuvers, end quote, in the antebellum US. Using female pronouns to describe Jones, Snorton analyzes this famous lithograph through the lens of 19th century popular media and visual culture, arguing that it reinforced, quote, a common sense about the fungibility of Blackness. Again, Snorton draws on the same primary sources and secondary authors, adding a close reading of the court transcript to show how state logics shaped Jones's account of her gender. And most recently, Jules Gill Peterson's 2024 book, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, devotes an entire chapter to Jones. This is the most extensive historical study we have of her to date. So foregrounding race over trans status, Gill Peterson argues, what was spectacular about Mary Jones was not that she was a trans woman, but rather that she was a free Black woman whose gender was already construed as so much trickery. Quote. Gill Peterson briefly references trans feminized sex workers from the early 1800s in the US and England, and an additional newspaper source on one of Jones's possible associates. However, her main innovation comes in a creative approach to discussing an absence of news sources. Engaging with Jones's claim recorded in a court transcript to have dressed as a woman in New Orleans previously as a clue that we could use to interpret her story differently, Gill Peterson uses Saidiya Hartman's method of critical fabulation, which involves crafting carefully contextualized speculative narratives that evoke possible or probable pasts where archival evidence is unrecoverable, to imagine a life that Mary Jones might have lived in New Orleans at the time. So over the past several years, there's been a flurry of news articles, social media posts, popular discussions, and even a film by the artist Tourmaline, which have all highlighted Mary Jones. Yet until Raya's 2022 blog post for the New York City Municipal Archives, no significant news sources on Jones's life have been unearthed. So over this time, we've seen scholars do a remarkable amount with a very small amount of material by adopting a set of different interpretive frameworks and methods. The history of sexuality, working class history, trans history, visual culture and media analysis, Black studies, critical fabulation. But the question we want to ask today is, what if different research methods could uncover actual new primary sources about her life and her social networks? And what if putting her story in the context of a broader transatlantic and diasporic approach could give us radical new insights into Black trans history? And so it's on this note that I'm going to hand it over to Raya to show how he has done just that.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second while I get my screen shared. Okay, so Nikita, if you would stop sharing yours, I'll start sharing mine. Not really sure how it all works, but
1 second.
yeah, don't worry. Okay, let's see. There we go. Share. Perfect. Okay, and let me go to the start. Good. Okay. Wonderful. So hi everyone. My name is Raya Kinsey. I'm also extremely excited to be sharing my work with you today. I want to start out by thanking Nikita, not only for that amazing introduction, but also for bringing my attention to an honestly life-changing piece of scholarship that has shaped much of what you're about to see in this upcoming part of the presentation. So while I've spent the last 4 or 5 years connecting the dots between Mary Jones's story and archival evidence of gender nonconformity from across the African diaspora, it wasn't until I read Jamie Jesperson's article, Transmisogyny in the Colonial Archive, that I encountered a framework for presenting what I found in a way that unapologetically advocates for the centrality of cases like Jones's to a specifically trans cultural communal history. The original title of this piece of the presentation was Remembering Mary Jones, and that's a reference to Jesperson's work. I'd like to begin by saying, I'd like to begin by asking you all, while you listen and watch, to think about the materiality of trans experiences. Where and how might that manifest archivally, and what can it do to work against the notions of scarcity and singularity that have thus far shaped the way we think about trans history? In June of 1836, a 33-year-old Black woman named Mary Jones was arrested for pickpocketing a white male client following a paid sexual encounter. While searching Mary's person for the stolen items, police found Mary's anatomy incongruent with her gender presentation. She was at this point recognized as the heretofore never captured masquerading thief, Peter Sewally. It is important to note that cross-dressing in a criminal context would not have been entirely unfamiliar to these officials. While wearing clothing incongruent with one's anatomy was not yet illegal in 1830s New York City, it was a strategy frequently employed by a variety of lawbreakers in order to avoid detection by law enforcement. When Mary was interviewed by court officials during her arraignment, it is likely that their inquiries as to her legal sex and mode of dress were informed by this reality. The reasoning Mary provided in response, however, was far beyond their familiarity. Almost 200 years later, those studying Mary's testimony remain at a loss for how to make sense of this 19th century Black individual whose open expression of femininity puts her at odds with even some of the most expansive understandings of antebellum life. My work attempts to address this tension. In the court proceedings and tabloid coverage that constitute the documentary record of Mary's 1836 case, the focus is largely her otherness. Previous scholars have located the primary basis of this portrayal in sexual and racial difference, attributing her depiction to anxieties within mainstream white antebellum culture surrounding queer masculinity and Blackness. Recently, misogynoir has proven an important framework for understanding the negative representation of Mary in records. But I always felt like there was more to Mary's story than her otherness. In reading about the violence she faced during her 1836 trial, where onlookers mocked her stylish feminine attire and stripped her of her wig, I thought about similar experiences faced by my Black trans feminine peers. I wondered if Mary, too, had a network of friends and allies to commiserate with. As a Black transgender non-conforming person myself, it suddenly didn't feel as important for me to narrow down which of the myriad of differences between themselves and Mary that onlookers were drawing upon to justify their behavior. Instead, I wanted to know, if Mary was so universally seen as aberrant, who made her dresses? Who did her hair? Who taught her how to pickpocket as a woman? How did she know how to make or where to procure her infamous genital prosthetic? These questions, born of my own experiences as a Black trans person, form the basis of my approach to the documentary record of Mary's life. Approaching trans identity as an interpretive or investigatory framework is something that many historical scholars are currently articulating. These scholars are, unsurprisingly, often transgender themselves. I personally find resonance in Jamie Jesperson's Transmisogyny in the Colonial Archive, Remembering Transfeminine Life and Death in New Spain, 1604 to 1821. In this 2023 article, Jesperson talks about following in the footsteps of trailblazing transfeminine historians such as Salish Wesley, Susan Stryker, Jules Gill-Peterson, and Gabrielle M.W. Bukowski, in taking seriously her embodied and lived experiences as a trans woman, through which she has been able to notice and investigate elements of oft-told stories, from self-declarations of womanhood to acts of trans sisterhood that have been overlooked by those before her. As a Black trans person, I know from firsthand experience that while gender identity is internal and doesn't need to be publicly expressed to be true or real, to move in society openly expressing one's gender in the way that Mary Jones did takes some form of community support. This is what makes Mary's testimony so fascinating. As archival access and awareness of trans identities expand, further examples of Black trans Americans will no doubt be found. The one cited here by scholar Caitlin G.V. Hopkins is just one amazing example. That said, I believe that Mary's case will continue to stand out because the records of her life speak not only to the presence of individual Black trans people in American history, but to the possibilities of Black trans culture and communal knowledge. To explain how I've come to this conclusion, allow me to share some of the documentation I've been lucky enough to surface about Mary's life following her 1836 arrest. Court records indicate that after Mary was tried and convicted for grand larceny, she was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in Sing Sing State Prison. Her date of release was likely June of 1841. Just 6 months later, on New Year's Eve of 1841, Mary was arrested again. This was the first of 16 arrests between Mary's release from Sing Sing in June of 1841 and the last known mention of her in press, which is April 1858. Most of the charges Mary faced during this period were for low-level offenses, including disorderly conduct and vagrancy, meaning that Mary served multiple 6-month to 1-year terms in places like Bridewell Penitentiary, in addition to her 2 known 5-year terms in Sing Sing State Prison, one in 1836 and the other in 1848. Though records show at least one semi-successful escape from imprisonment, Mary spent a large portion of the 1840s behind bars. Often, almost as soon as she was released, she would be recognized and rearrested. The rapid pace of arrests and confinements was likely influenced by New York State's criminalization of masquerading in 1845. Passed in response to ongoing riots throughout the state, the 1845 statute addressed incidents in which white male insurgents sought to conceal their identities by dressing as Indians and as women. The first anti-masquerade law in the US, it criminalized disguises on public streets, as well as mass gatherings in places like bars and eating houses, and enabled police to arrest disguised individuals on site. For Mary, this meant that the simple act of wearing feminine attire was now enough to put her in jail. At 5'5" inches, at 5 foot 5 inches tall, with a thoroughly feminine voice and overall demeanor, Mary's anatomical sex was not immediately recognized by onlookers. Records indicate that Mary frequently dressed in the latest fashions and passed as a woman in her late 20s when she was nearly 50. There was one group of people predisposed to interpret Mary's attire as disguise, however. Unfortunately for Mary, that group was her local police. These men would have already been suspicious of women, and especially Black women, in public at night. Knowing Mary's story from peers and from the tabloids, they may have employed extra scrutiny to these women, noting characteristics such as evidence of depilation or false hair that otherwise would have been overlooked. So, why do we find Mary frequenting the same areas where law enforcement had clearly come to recognize her? Why did she not move elsewhere, where she was less likely to be outed? When every choice of hers from where to go to what to wear meant facing violence and imprisonment, it makes sense to operate on the assumption that there was some logic shaping those choices. What experiences shaped this logic? Intuition tells me that perhaps the answer is simple. The spaces in which Mary lived and worked were likely ones in which her identity was affirmed by her peers. But who were these peers? What made them more accepting than, say, the police officers who seemed to have had it out for Mary, or the onlookers at court who hurled abuse at her? In exploring these questions, I was especially curious about the people of her own color who Mary referenced in her 1836 testimony. Were these biological or chosen family? Was their particular openness to Mary's gender presentation emblematic of the urban landscape or something more nuanced? Something perhaps specific to certain sectors of the Black community of that time? If these were chosen family, where and how did Mary encounter them? Were they replacements for an unaccepting bio family, as is the case for many trans people today? Or was Mary isolated from her bio family for other reasons, like enslavement or forced migration? So it's at this point that my script kind of goes a little off the rails. I want to introduce some of the newer research I've come upon, and it's still a little rough, so bear with me. But here is one of the things I've been thinking about, just considering the broader strands of history that may have shaped Mary's story: the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism. I've started to think about the idea of space. And before I can get into those really broad questions of space, I started thinking like very concretely about the spaces that are documented in the record of Mary's life. Where are the places where she's noted as being arrested? How do those spaces sort of connect with one another? And I found some pretty interesting things. I mean, it seems that her home at 108 Green Street in 1836 isn't that far away from where she was living in 1848 when she was again arrested for the same offense. Both of those places are about maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk down West, maybe not 5 to 10, maybe like 15-minute walk down West Broadway to Bill Thompson's Panel Crib, a place where she was known to frequent in the 1840s. Also, she was arrested somewhere on West Broadway in 1846. I mean, it's just so interesting to me that all of these spaces are in very close proximity to one another, and they all follow like this major sort of artery through this part of the city, not only connecting spaces that were known to be associated with Black folks, recent immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, and also like a burgeoning queer community. You have down here near the bottom of the map, you'll see City Hall Park. And that was known to be a cruising ground of sorts in 1840s New York. You'll see it passing several theaters, which were also associated with, especially in Jules Gill Peterson's work, she talks about other trans women, white trans women who were associated with the theater and female quote unquote impersonation. And they could have been working out of those theater spots. And then of course you have the 5 Points, someplace where Mary was known to have frequented in the 1830s and 40s, also a place where a lot of Black folks lived, where immigrants lived. And I would also question, what are the implications for queer and also possibly trans life there? So another sort of thorough line that connects these spaces are other people, not just Mary Jones, but people like Bill Thompson or William Thompson. In looking more closely into him, I found out that he lived at 108 Green Street, where Mary lived, and in 1836. And apparently he was the one who was running that brothel. So if she was living and working out of a space that he owned in 1836, and then in the early 1840s known to frequent another place that he owned or operated, what is the connection between her and William Thompson? I wanted to know more about that, see what it could reveal about her sort of social network of other Black folks in this time and place, who are kind of operating in this sort of subaltern culture. Little more work on Bill Thompson. Found out that he was called an old offender in 1833, which means that he was already known to police by 1833. So I looked to see if I can get a little deeper into his story, see if I can find him even farther back than the 1830s. And bingo, was able to find him being sent to Newgate Prison in 1805. And what's especially interesting about this to me is that it gives his place of birth as the West Indies. So that's where I start seeing Mary's story sort of blossom out of the sort of like singularly American context to having this much, much broader international connection. Because in Mary's Sing Sing prison admission record, we see that she's also noted as being born in the West Indies. So why is this important? Well, the West Indies has a lot of really amazing sort of documented evidence of Black gender nonconformity. A set of records that just hasn't been surfaced to that same extent here in this part of the Americas, or that at least I haven't been able to see. You have the history of Carnival, which involves sort of ritualized gender nonconformity and either does or can create a space for trans identities, queer identities to be expressed. Definitely that's the case now. So why not in the 19th and 18th centuries? You also see that sort of ritualized gender nonconformity as being this inheritance from West and Central Africa, which does have this history of gender nonconforming people, especially people who are assigned male at birth, and the expression of femininity being interpreted as someone being more susceptible to having the spirit world speak through them. And that created a situation in which trans folks were not seen as being outside of community or to be degraded, but actually held in this place of reverence within a communal context in sort of colonial era West and Central Africa. And it seems like that's a tradition that may have been influencing the Black communities, both in the Caribbean and in those other Afro-diasporic contexts, such as here in America. When thinking about that, I was poking around online and found the case of Victoria, who was an enslaved person in 1500s Portugal. And it kind of drew all those things together for me because not only was she a Black trans woman, also a sex worker who got caught up in this sort of legal prosecution system, but she was known to be a spiritual advisor for her community. She was known in her community as someone whose, gender identity may have been a little confusing to people, but not something that was seemingly threatening to her, well, to the people of her own color. Which just makes me think that there's definitely something to this sort of connection between the spirituality of West and Central Africa to how people like Mary Jones were able to connect with other Black people in these sort of colonial and post-colonial Afro-diasporic contexts. A final thing, sorry if I've gone over time, but I was able to find this really great article from 1835, a year before the first known evidence of Mary Jones. It's about another Black trans woman named Sarah Thompson, and she was living very close to 108 Green Street. And also, again, her anatomical sex was discovered while she was in the midst of doing some sort of pickpocketing. So again, when you map out 45 Renwick Street, where the Sarah Thompson was living and arrested, and all of these places that Mary Jones has lived, it fits so well that it does make me wonder, like, could this be Mary Jones? And what does this extra information about her life prior to the 1830s, how does all of that fit then, if this is indeed the same person? And yeah, lots of questions, but hopefully I will keep you all updated as I come upon new things. But thank you so much.